Ever wondered what your seemingly ordinary neighbors are really up to behind closed doors, or if your quiet life holds hidden pockets of unexpected adventure? Like the video, subscribe the channel and turn on post notification, and go to the comments now and write where you're watching from. Arthur Penhaligon was a rich man. His house was big and in a very nice part of town. Everything around his house was neat and tidy, just the way he liked it. Every morning, he had a cup of tea. He would sit by the big window and read the news on his tablet. Usually, everything outside was calm and quiet. Birds sang, the water sprinklers made a soft noise, and sometimes he would see someone walking their dog. It was a peaceful life. But this morning was different. Arthur was drinking his tea and reading about money stuff. Suddenly, he looked up. Something outside caught his eye. He almost dropped his teacup. In the middle of the street, right in front of his house, were Agnes and Mr. Henderson. Agnes was Arthur's maid. She was usually very quiet and nice. Mr. Henderson lived next door. He was a quiet man who loved his flowers. Now, they were having a big fight. Agnes and Mr. Henderson were standing near the line between their yards. Arthur looked closely. It seemed like a small flower pot had fallen over. There were also some dead flower petals on the ground. "You and your bad stuff for killing plants, Henderson," Agnes shouted. Her voice was usually soft, but now it was loud. She waved her arms around wildly. Her shoes almost came off. Mr. Henderson's face turned red. Usually, it was pale. "My stuff is not bad. It's good for plants, and those were my special purple flowers. You probably stepped on them with your big gardening shoes." The words they were using were not that mean, but they were still fighting. Arthur, who used to make big deals with important people, was very confused. Then, the fight got even stranger. Agnes tried to grab Mr. Henderson. He moved very quickly to the side. Arthur remembered seeing that move in an old movie. Arthur held his teacup and watched. This was much more interesting than the news. He thought about calling his housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, but decided not to. He wanted to see what would happen next. Agnes didn't give up. She grabbed the closest thing she could find. It was a long, colorful foam thing that kids use in the pool. It must have come from Arthur's pool. Agnes held it like a sword and swung it at Mr. Henderson. He tried to get away, making little scared noises. "Take that, you flower killer," Agnes yelled. She hit Mr. Henderson on the arm with the foam thing. It didn't look like it hurt much. "Ouch, that's hitting me with a floaty thing," Mr. Henderson said. He grabbed a small statue from his yard. It was a funny-looking man with a fishing pole. He held it up like a little club. Arthur watched and smiled. This was so strange. His maid, who cleaned his fancy furniture, was now fighting with his neighbor, who loved his roses. They were using pool toys and garden statues as weapons. He took out his phone. He wanted to take a video of this. It was too funny to not share later. He tried to hold the phone steady, but he was laughing inside. The fight kept going. Mr. Henderson tried to hit Agnes with the little statue, but he tripped on a water sprinkler. He fell down right in the middle of his flowers. Agnes saw her chance. She tried to sit on his back to stop him. But she lost her balance and fell off, landing next to him with a soft thump. "Get off me, you person who makes trouble," Mr. Henderson said, trying to get up. "Not until you say sorry for saying bad things about my gardening," Agnes said, trying to sit on him again. By now, other people in the neighborhood had come outside. Mrs. Abernathy, who knew everything about everyone, came out of her house. She looked over her short green fence with big, curious eyes. "What in the world is going on here?" she said loudly. Everyone on the street could hear her. Soon, more people came out. Mr. and Mrs. Davison, who had a baby that always cried, stood on their porch. They forgot about the baby for a minute as they watched the fight. Even old Mr. Fitzwilliam, who usually stayed inside, came to the edge of his yard. He turned up his hearing aids so he could hear what was happening. "Looks like Agnes finally got angry," Mrs. Abernathy told everyone. Her eyes were wide with excitement. "I always knew she had a temper. Remember when those silver spoons went missing?" Arthur heard this and almost choked again. The missing spoons had been in a box in his attic for months. More funny things happened in the fight. Mr. Henderson got up and tried to use a bird bath as a shield. But when Agnes hit it with the foam thing, it broke into pieces. "My special bird bath," he cried. He held the broken pieces like they were very important. "Oh, come on, it was probably just made in a factory," Agnes said. She slipped on some wet grass and almost fell down. Just then, They heard the music of the ice cream truck. If you're yet to subscribe to the channel or haven't liked the video, do so now so you don't miss when another story like this is posted on the channel. It was coming down the street. Agnes and Mr. Henderson stopped fighting for a second. They both looked towards the truck, thinking about ice cream. Arthur watched, completely surprised. One minute they were fighting like crazy, and the next they wanted ice cream. The ice cream truck drove past. The music got quieter. Agnes and Mr. Henderson seemed to remember they were fighting. They started again. "Okay, where were we?" Agnes said, holding up the foam thing again. "You were about to pay for my purple flowers." Mr. Henderson growled. He picked up a long wooden stick from his croquet set. The fight started again. It got even sillier. Agnes tried to kick Mr. Henderson, but she missed him completely and almost fell into his rose bushes. Mr. Henderson tried to trip her with the wooden stick, but he tripped himself and fell backwards into his big pink flamingo pool float. The neighbors who were watching were now laughing out loud. Some of them were even shouting silly advice. "Try to kick him high, Agnes," yelled young Tim Davison. He was having more fun watching this than his cartoons. "Watch out for the little statue, Henderson. It's sneaky," Mrs. Abernathy called out, holding her hand over her eyes to see better. Arthur, still taking his video, shook his head. This was the most exciting thing that had happened in his quiet neighborhood in a long time. He zoomed in on his tablet. He saw Agnes throw some dead leaves at Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson tried to spray her with a garden hose, but he sprayed water all over himself. The fight went on for a long time. It was like a funny dance of arms and legs, silly weapons, and tired noises. Arthur watched as Agnes and Mr. Henderson, their clothes messy and their faces red, walked around the street like two kids having a big fight in public. Finally, the fight stopped. Just like that, Agnes and Mr. Henderson both looked very tired. They stood there breathing hard. They were still looking angry at each other, but they didn't have any more energy to fight. "Well," Agnes said, wiping some dirt off her face, "I think we showed each other." "Yes," Mr. Henderson agreed, fixing his glasses that were now crooked. "But I still think your big shoes were the problem." "My shoes are very good," Agnes said, but she didn't sound as angry as before. Then, something even stranger happened. Agnes and Mr. Henderson, still looking a little messy, started to clean themselves up. Mr. Henderson straightened his tie, which was now around his ear. Agnes smoothed down her apron. "So," Mr. Henderson said, sounding very normal, "how do you think that went?" Agnes thought for a minute. She put her finger on her chin. "The move with the foam thing could have been better. I need to practice turning faster. And my attack with the little statue was easy to see coming," Mr. Henderson said. "I should have tried to surprise you." Arthur, watching from his window, almost dropped his tablet again. What was going on? They were talking about their silly fight like it was a practice? "The water sprinkler was a good idea," Agnes said. She sounded like she was giving a compliment. "But I almost fell down." "Yes, the timing was a little off," Mr. Henderson agreed. "We need to do that at the same time next time." "Next time?" Arthur said to himself. There was going to be a next time? The other neighbors, who had been enjoying the show, now looked confused too. Mrs. Abernathy looked like she needed to sit down. Agnes and Mr. Henderson didn't notice anyone watching. They kept talking about their fight. "Overall, I would say it was pretty good," Agnes said, nodding her head. "But we both need to get stronger." "I agree," Mr. Henderson said. He put out his hand. "Should we say it was a tie today?" Agnes shook his hand. She had a small smile on her face, like they had a secret. "A tie it is, Henderson." Then, like nothing had happened, Agnes turned and walked towards Arthur's house. Mr. Henderson started picking up his broken flower pot and dead flowers. Arthur stood by the window, completely shocked. He watched as Agnes walked up to his front door. He barely heard the doorbell ring. He finally opened the door. "Good morning, Mr. Penhaligon," Agnes said. She sounded happy as usual. "The weather is nice today, isn't it? But maybe not so good for the flowers." Arthur could only look at her. His mouth was open. "Agnes," he finally said, What was all that?" Agnes looked at him like she didn't know what he was talking about. "All what, sir? Oh, you mean the little fight with Mr. Henderson? Just a little bit of fun between neighbors, sir. Nothing to worry about." "Fun? Agnes, you were hitting him with a pool toy and he was hitting you with a garden statue," Arthur said loudly. Agnes laughed a little. "Oh, you know how it is, sir. Sometimes these things just happen. But it's all okay now. Should I start washing the clothes?" If you're yet to subscribe to the channel or haven't liked the video, do so now so you don't miss when another story like this is posted on the channel. Arthur just nodded. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. He watched as Agnes walked into the house. He stood on the porch, still very confused. Later that day, Arthur sat in his office. He was watching the video of the fight on his tablet. He saw Agnes and Mr. Henderson doing their silly moves and saying their strange words. He couldn't stop thinking about it. It was more than just a fight between neighbors. There was something else going on. They seemed to know what the other person was going to do. It was like they had a secret plan. Arthur decided to find out more. He started with Mr. Henderson. He looked him up online. He found out that his quiet neighbor used to work for the government in another country. The job sounded very special and secret. Words like languages, spying, and old war kept showing up. Arthur's heart started beating faster. Could it be true? Then he looked up Agnes. There wasn't much about her online. A few things about her helping out at the library, but nothing about her past. This made Arthur even more curious. He remembered some strange things about Agnes. She knew a lot about different languages. She always seemed to know what he wanted before he even asked. There was a small mark above her eye that she always covered with her hair. He remembered talking to her once about her travels before she started working for him. She said she had visited places like Beirut and Berlin a long time ago, when things were very tense in the world. These were not normal places for a house cleaner to visit. Everything started to make sense. It was so unbelievable, but it seemed true. The next morning, Arthur waited nervously for Agnes to come to work. When she arrived, smiling as usual, he decided to ask her about it, but carefully. "Agnes," he started, trying to sound relaxed, "I was just wondering. You said you traveled a lot before you worked for me." Agnes smiled. "Oh, yes, sir. I saw many parts of the world when I was younger." "And what kind of work did you do?" Arthur asked, his hands a little sweaty. Agnes stopped for a moment. Her eyes looked like they were smiling too. "Let's just say, Mr. Penhaligon, that I did work where it was very important to keep things private. And some skills were very useful." Arthur swallowed hard. "Skills like fighting with your hands?" Agnes laughed softly. "Well, sometimes things did get a little rough." Just then, Mr. Henderson walked past the window, carrying a watering can. He looked at Arthur and gave him a small nod. Arthur turned back to Agnes. "Agnes," he said quietly, were you, a spy?" Agnes smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Let's just say, Mr. Penhaligon, that I have some special skills. Skills that I learned over a very long time. Skills that make me very good at dealing with things like flowers that are not growing well." Arthur just looked at her, his mouth wide open. It was true. The silly fight, the strange words, the way they seemed to know what to do. It had all been a planned practice. "And Mr. Henderson?" Arthur asked, still very surprised. Agnes nodded towards the window. "Ah, yes. Henderson and I know each other from a long time ago. We used to be partners. On different sides, of course, back then. But now that we are retired, we think it's a good way to stay in shape." "You mean, that fight, it was practice?" Arthur said, still trying to understand. "Exactly," Agnes said, her smile getting bigger. "We try to make it as real as possible. Silly reasons to start, using things we find around as weapons. You would be surprised how useful a foam pool toy can be." Arthur thought about the broken bird bath, the flat flamingo float, the mess in the street. "Useful is one way to say it," he said quietly. "We have to be ready, you see," Agnes said, her voice getting quieter like she was telling a secret. "You never know when you might need those old skills again. Plus, it's a little bit of fun, don't you think?" Arthur could only look at her. His neat and tidy life suddenly felt very strange. His quiet maid and his quiet neighbor were actually retired spies, practicing their skills by having silly fights in the street. He thought about his own life, his normal days, worrying about money and food. It all seemed so boring now. Agnes saw that he was very surprised. She patted him on the arm gently. "Don't worry, Mr. Penhaligon. We are very careful. We wouldn't want to scare anyone." Scare anyone? Arthur thought. His maid and neighbor had just had a big fight in his street, and she was worried about scaring people? Just then, Mr. Henderson walked past the window again. This time he smiled and winked at Arthur. Arthur could only give him a small, confused smile back. As Agnes started her work, singing softly to herself as she cleaned his old furniture, Arthur Penhaligon sat in his office. If you're yet to subscribe to the channel or haven't liked the video, do so now so you don't miss when another story like this is posted on the channel. The video of the fun between neighbors was still playing on his tablet. He looked out at his perfect green grass, at the quiet street. He started to understand something. His life, he now knew, was not as calm and normal as he had always thought. It was a life where secrets were hidden, where normal people could be amazing, and where a morning cup of tea could come with the surprising show of retired spies having a silly fight about dead flowers. And somehow, Arthur Penhaligon, the rich man who didn't know much about the real world, thought it was actually pretty interesting. His quiet life had just become much more exciting. Arthur Penhaligon couldn't shake the image of Agnes wielding a pool noodle like a seasoned warrior, albeit a slightly clumsy one. The revelation that his seemingly ordinary maid and neighbor were retired spies had burrowed its way into his consciousness, replacing his usual preoccupation with stock market fluctuations and the proper temperature for aging his single malt scotch. His days now took on a new rhythm. The morning tea ritual remained, but the Wall Street Journal lay largely ignored as his gaze constantly drifted towards the street, hoping for a glimpse of Agnes and Mr. Henderson engaging in another clandestine training exercise. He replayed the video of their first encounter countless times, analyzing their clumsy moves with the intensity of a military strategist studying enemy tactics. He even started taking notes, jotting down observations like, Henderson's gnome defense surprisingly effective against soft foam projectiles, and, Agnes's tripping hazard potential significantly increased by wet grass. He found himself listening to their everyday conversations with a new ear, trying to decipher hidden meanings in coded messages. When Agnes mentioned needing to pick up supplies from the local depot, Arthur wondered if she was referring to a clandestine meeting with an underground network rather than a trip to the supermarket. When Mr. Henderson complained about the infiltration of weeds into his prize-winning roses, Arthur pondered if he was speaking metaphorically about a rival spy agency's attempts to undermine his suburban tranquility. The mundane had become extraordinary, and Arthur was utterly captivated. His life, once a predictable sequence of comfortable routines, now held the tantalizing possibility of intrigue and adventure, even if it was only vicariously through his maid and neighbor. One afternoon, while Agnes was dusting his collection of antique porcelain figurines, Arthur decided to broach the subject again, albeit with a newfound sense of awkward enthusiasm. Agnes, he began, trying to sound nonchalant, that disagreement you had with Mr. Henderson the other day, it was quite spirited. Agnes paused her dusting, a slight smile playing on her lips. Indeed, sir, we both felt rather strongly about the matter of the petunias. Arthur leaned forward conspiratorially. Right, the petunias. Of course. But, was there perhaps more to it than just horticulture? Agnes's smile widened slightly. Mr. Penhaligon, you have a very active imagination. But, the pivoting with the pool noodle, Arthur pressed on, and Mr. Henderson's gnome counter-offensive. They seemed rather well rehearsed, in a chaotic sort of way. Agnes chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. We do enjoy a bit of physical activity, sir. Keeps us young, you know. Arthur, who considered his most strenuous activity to be lifting his teacup, found this explanation somewhat lacking. Right, physical activity. Like, spy training? He blurted out, then immediately regretted his bluntness. Agnes simply raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Spy training, sir? Good heavens, whatever gave you that idea? Arthur, flustered, fumbled for an explanation. Well, Mr. Henderson's background in the Foreign Office, and your extensive travels, and the way you both handled yourselves during the Petunia incident. It all just seemed to point in that direction. Agnes placed the porcelain figurine back on the shelf with meticulous care. Mr. Penhaligon, she said gently, sometimes things are not always as they seem. And sometimes, a disagreement over flowers is just a disagreement over flowers. Arthur wasn't convinced, but he knew when he was being politely stonewalled. He decided to try a different approach. The next time he saw Mr. Henderson tending to his roses, Arthur ventured out into his own garden, a pair of pristine gardening gloves looking utterly out of place on his manicured hands. Good morning, Henderson, Arthur said, attempting a casual tone. Those roses are looking particularly vibrant this year. Mr. Henderson straightened up, a wary look in his eyes. Morning, Penhaligon. Yes, they're coming along nicely. I was just admiring your agility the other day, Arthur continued, trying to steer the conversation towards the more interesting topic. That sidestep you did when Agnes lunged. Very impressive. Mr. Henderson's wariness intensified. Just trying to avoid getting hit with a pool toy, Penhaligon. Nothing more to it. Of course, Arthur said quickly. But it reminded me of, well, some of those old films. You know, the ones with secret agents. Mr. Henderson clipped a dead rosebud with unnecessary force. Can't say I'm much of a film buff, Penhaligon. Arthur sighed inwardly. They were both being remarkably tight-lipped. He decided to take a leap of faith. Look, Henderson, he said, lowering his voice slightly, I know about you and Agnes. The training. Mr. Henderson froze, his clippers hovering midair. He slowly turned to face Arthur, his expression now a mixture of surprise and concern. What exactly do you think you know, Penhaligon? He asked, his voice low and serious. Arthur held up his hands in a gesture of peace. Nothing that would put anyone in danger, I assure you. I saw the fight, and then I did a little research. Mr. Henderson's gaze narrowed. Research? Yes, Arthur admitted. Your background in the Foreign Office. Agnes's travels, it all adds up. Mr. Henderson remained silent for a long moment, studying Arthur's face. Finally, he sighed. Well, Penhaligon, it seems the cat's out of the bag, as they say. Arthur beamed. So it's true? Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. Yes, Agnes and I. We have a history. And we do occasionally engage in, shall we say, refresher exercises. That's incredible, Arthur exclaimed, his eyes wide with excitement. Can I watch next time? Mr. Henderson looked taken aback. Watch, Penhaligon, this is private. I understand, of course, Arthur said quickly, trying to mask his disappointment. But I'm very discreet. I wouldn't tell a soul. And perhaps I could even be of assistance? You know, as an observer? Or maybe even a participant? Mr. Henderson stared at him, a look of utter disbelief on his face. Participate? Penhaligon, with all due respect, you look like you might pull a muscle reaching for your morning newspaper. Arthur bristled slightly. I may not be as physically agile as you two, but I'm a quick learner. And I'm very enthusiastic. Mr. Henderson considered this for a moment, a faint smile twitching at the corner of his lips. Enthusiastic, perhaps, but also utterly clueless. But I could learn, Arthur insisted. Think of it, you could teach me some basic spy skills. It would be an adventure. Mr. Henderson shook his head, chuckling softly. Penhaligon, your idea of adventure probably involves trying a new brand of tea. This is not a game. It's about maintaining skills that were once vital. Despite Mr. Henderson's reservations, Arthur persisted. Over the next few days, he subtly, or so he thought, tried to ingratiate himself with both Agnes and Mr. Henderson. He offered Agnes extra help with chores around the house, much to her amusement. He even attempted to assist Mr. Henderson with his gardening, resulting in a near catastrophe involving a misplaced fertilizer and a very unhappy rose bush. Finally, one sunny Saturday morning, Arthur saw Agnes and Mr. Henderson standing at the edge of their lawns, a familiar glint of playful antagonism in their eyes. He cautiously approached them, his heart pounding with anticipation. Good morning, Arthur said, trying to sound casual. Lovely day for gardening. Agnes and Mr. Henderson exchanged a look. Indeed, Agnes said, a hint of a smile in her voice. We were just about to prune some overgrown hedges. Arthur's ears perked up. Prune overgrown hedges? With what sort of tools? Mr. Henderson held up a pair of oversized inflatable boxing gloves. These should do the trick. Arthur's jaw dropped. This was it, his chance. Could I, perhaps, observe the pruning process? He asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. Agnes and Mr. Henderson looked at each other again, then back at Arthur. There was a moment of silent communication before Mr. Henderson sighed. All right, Penhaligon, he said, a resigned tone in his voice. You can watch, but stay out of the way. And for heaven's sake, don't try to join in. Arthur could barely contain his excitement. He stood at a safe distance as Agnes and Mr. Henderson began their hedge pruning exercise. It started with some playful jabs and clumsy footwork, reminiscent of their previous encounter but with the added absurdity of the giant boxing gloves. Then, to Arthur's surprise, Agnes turned to him. Mr. Penhaligon, she said, tossing him a smaller pair of inflatable gloves. "Since you're so keen to learn, perhaps you could practice your defensive stance." If you're yet to subscribe to the channel or haven't liked the video, do so now so you don't miss when another story like this is posted on the channel. Arthur's eyes widened. He was actually going to participate. He eagerly put on the gloves, which were far too big for his hands, making him look like a slightly deflated cartoon character. Agnes gave him a few basic instructions, which mostly involved keeping his hands up and trying not to trip over his own feet. Mr. Henderson, meanwhile, was demonstrating a series of exaggerated punches and dodges, occasionally landing a soft, comical blow on Agnes's padded arms. Arthur attempted to mimic their movements, but his attempts were far from graceful. He stumbled, he flailed, and he nearly knocked himself out with his own oversized glove. Agnes and Mr. Henderson exchanged amused glances, but they patiently continued their demonstration. The training progressed into even more ridiculous scenarios. Mr. Henderson tried to use a garden hose as a makeshift whip, only to get it tangled around a lawn chair. Agnes attempted a stealthy approach, crawling through the flower beds with surprising agility despite her age, while Arthur tripped over a strategically placed garden gnome, the same one from their previous fight, and landed in a heap of mulch. At one point, Agnes and Mr. Henderson paused their exercise to give Arthur some pointers. "You need to be more fluid, Mr. Penhaligon," Agnes advised, trying to suppress a giggle. "Think like water, and try to anticipate your opponent's moves," Mr. Henderson added, demonstrating a slow-motion jab. "Although, in your case, Penhaligon, just staying upright would be a good start." Arthur tried his best to follow their instructions, but his efforts were mostly in vain. He was far more adept at managing his investment portfolio than wielding an inflatable boxing glove. Their training session was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Abernathy, who emerged from her house carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Arthur wearing oversized boxing gloves and looking thoroughly disheveled. "Well, this is a sight for sore eyes," she said, her gaze shifting between Arthur, Agnes, and Mr. Henderson, who were all trying to look like they were engaged in a perfectly normal suburban activity. "What in the world is going on here?" Agnes, ever quick thinking, stepped forward. "We're just having a bit of fun, Mrs. Abernathy. Mr. Penhaligon is trying out a new fitness regime." Mrs. Abernathy raised a skeptical eyebrow, her gaze lingering on the inflatable boxing gloves and the tangled garden hose. "Fitness regime, you say? Looks more like a circus act to me." Despite the occasional interruption, Arthur continued to participate in Agnes and Mr. Henderson's training sessions over the next few weeks. He learned, or at least attempted to learn, various spy techniques, most of which involved everyday household objects and a healthy dose of slapstick. He tried to master the art of discreet observation by hiding behind ridiculously small bushes and awkwardly peering over fences. He attempted silent infiltration by tiptoeing through the garden, invariably tripping over something and announcing his presence with a loud crash. He even had a go at improvised weaponry, which mostly involved him accidentally hitting himself with whatever object he was trying to wield. Agnes and Mr. Henderson were surprisingly patient with him, offering encouragement and gentle corrections, though Arthur often caught them exchanging amused glances behind his back. They seemed to appreciate his enthusiasm, even if his execution left much to be desired. One afternoon, after a particularly chaotic training session involving a rogue frisbee and a misplaced garden rake, Arthur sat down on his patio, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. "You know," he said to Agnes and Mr. Henderson, who were enjoying a well-deserved cup of tea, "I'm starting to understand why you do this. It's actually quite invigorating." Mr. Henderson chuckled. "Invigorating is one word for it, Penhaligon. Another might be utterly ridiculous." Agnes smiled warmly. "But you're trying, Mr. Penhaligon, and that's what matters." Arthur puffed out his chest slightly. "I think I'm making progress. I almost managed to avoid tripping over that gnome today." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb in front of Mr. Henderson's house. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene with an air of quiet authority. Agnes and Mr. Henderson exchanged a look of surprise, a flicker of their old, serious spy personas returning to their eyes. "Looks like we have a visitor," Mr. Henderson murmured, setting down his teacup. The man approached them, his gaze briefly taking in Arthur, who still had a stray leaf stuck in his hair from his silent infiltration practice. "Henderson," the man said, his voice carrying a hint of a foreign accent. "It's been a while." Mr. Henderson stood up, his posture suddenly straighter. "Markov, what brings you to our quiet corner of the world?" The man, Markov, smiled thinly. Let's just say an old acquaintance needed a little reminder. His eyes flicked towards Agnes. "And I thought I'd pay a visit to a certain nightingale as well." Agnes's smile vanished. "Markov, I thought we'd seen the last of you." Arthur watched this exchange with a mixture of confusion and excitement. This wasn't part of their usual training. This felt real. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside?" Mr. Henderson suggested, his voice calm but firm. Markov nodded. "An excellent idea." He turned to Arthur, a polite but dismissive smile on his face. "Please excuse us. Old business, you understand." As Agnes, Mr. Henderson, and Markov walked towards Mr. Henderson's house, Arthur couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. It seemed his quiet suburban life was about to get a whole lot more interesting, and perhaps, just perhaps, his clumsy attempts at becoming a spy might actually come in handy after all. He still had those oversized inflatable boxing gloves, didn't he? Arthur, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, tried to appear nonchalant as Agnes, Mr. Henderson, and the mysterious Markov disappeared into Mr. Henderson's house. Old business, indeed. Arthur couldn't help but feel a surge of importance. He was practically in the middle of a real spy drama. His first instinct was to discreetly observe. He tiptoed across the manicured lawn towards Mr. Henderson's house, pressing his ear against the closed living room window. He could hear muffled voices, but couldn't quite make out the words. He tried peeking through the gap in the curtains, but they were drawn shut. Frustrated, Arthur circled the house, his attempts at stealth resembling a particularly clumsy rhinoceros trying to navigate a china shop. He nearly tripped over a bird feeder, bumped into a garden statue, a different, equally grotesque gnome, and narrowly avoided stepping into Mr. Henderson's meticulously arranged rock garden. Finally, he found an open window in what appeared to be the study. He cautiously approached and peered inside. Agnes, Mr. Henderson, and Markov were seated around a small table, their expressions serious. Markov was speaking in a low, measured tone, occasionally gesturing with his hands. Arthur strained his ears, finally catching snippets of their conversation. Words like intel, compromised, and extraction point floated through the air, confirming Arthur's wildest suspicions. This was definitely not about wilting petunias. He gathered that Markov represented some sort of organization, and there was a situation involving a former colleague who had gotten into some trouble. Agnes and Mr. Henderson, despite their retirement, possessed unique skills that were needed to resolve the issue. Arthur's mind raced. This was his chance. He could finally put his rudimentary spy training to the test. He imagined himself bursting into the room, using his inflatable boxing gloves to disarm Markov and save the day. The reality, he suspected, would be far less heroic. Deciding that direct intervention might be premature, Arthur opted for a more subtle approach. He remembered Agnes's advice about thinking like water. He tried to channel his inner fluidity as he crept back towards his own house, formulating a plan. He decided his best course of action was to gather supplies. Every good spy needed gadgets, right? He rummaged through his garage, unearthing a collection of items that he thought might be useful. A pair of oversized binoculars, a child's walkie-talkie set, a Swiss Army knife with far too many useless attachments, and his trusty video camera, for surveillance, of course. Armed with his makeshift spy kit, Arthur returned to the vicinity of Mr. Henderson's house, trying to look inconspicuous as he lurked behind a large hydrangea bush. He raised his binoculars, focusing them on the living room window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ongoing meeting. Just then, he heard a rustling sound behind him. He whirled around, nearly tripping over his own feet, to see Mrs. Abernathy peering at him from behind her own hedge, a pair of high-powered opera glasses clutched in her hand. "Arthur?" she whispered, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" Arthur, caught red-handed, stammered for an explanation. "Just admiring the shrubbery, Mrs. Abernathy. It's a particularly robust hydrangea." Mrs. Abernathy's gaze narrowed. "With binoculars? And a video camera? Arthur, don't think I haven't noticed all the strange goings-on at Henderson's lately. First the fighting, now this. I think something very peculiar is happening." Before Arthur could concoct a believable lie, the front door of Mr. Henderson's house opened, and Agnes and Markov emerged, followed by Mr. Henderson. If you're yet to subscribe to the channel or haven't liked the video, do so now so you don't miss when another story like this is posted on the channel. Markov shook hands with them, a polite but firm expression on his face, before getting back into his sleek black car and driving away. Agnes and Mr. Henderson watched the car disappear down the street, then turned to see Arthur and Mrs. Abernathy peering at them from behind their respective bushes. Mr. Henderson sighed. "Well, this is just splendid." Agnes approached Arthur, a mixture of amusement and exasperation on her face. "Mr. Penhaligon, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Arthur, feeling slightly foolish, lowered his binoculars. "Just keeping an eye out. You know, in case you needed backup." Agnes chuckled softly. "Backup? Mr. Penhaligon, I think we had things well in hand." Mr. Henderson joined them, shaking his head. "Penhaligon, this isn't some sort of game. This is serious business." I know, Arthur said earnestly. "And I want to help. I've been practicing. Remember the defensive stance with the inflatable gloves?" Agnes and Mr. Henderson exchanged a look that clearly said, "How could we forget?" Despite their initial reservations, Agnes and Mr. Henderson realized that Arthur, in his own well-meaning but utterly clueless way, had stumbled upon a real situation. They decided that perhaps involving him, in a very limited capacity, might be better than having him blunder around and potentially interfere. "All right, Penhaligon," Mr. Henderson said, a hint of a plan forming in his eyes. "There might be a small task you could assist with. But you must do exactly as we say. No improvising." Arthur's face lit up. "Anything. Just tell me what to do." Over the next few hours, Agnes and Mr. Henderson cautiously filled Arthur in on the situation. The former colleague, it turned out, had valuable information that needed to be retrieved discreetly. Markov's visit was a reminder of the potential risks involved. Arthur's task was far less glamorous than he had imagined. He was tasked with a simple surveillance job, watching a particular location and reporting any unusual activity. Agnes and Mr. Henderson provided him with detailed instructions, emphasizing the importance of remaining unseen and unheard. Armed with his binoculars and walkie-talkies, Arthur took his post, feeling like a real secret agent on a crucial mission. He spent what felt like an eternity hiding behind a newspaper stand, occasionally peering out to observe the designated building. His first few hours were uneventful. He mostly observed pigeons pecking at crumbs and a rather grumpy-looking postal worker making his rounds. Boredom started to set in, and Arthur found himself fighting the urge to try out some of his silent infiltration techniques. Just as he was starting to question the excitement level of real espionage, he noticed something unusual. A nondescript van pulled up to the building, and two men in dark suits emerged, looking around suspiciously. This was it. Action. Arthur fumbled for his walkie-talkie, his hands shaking with excitement. "Agnes? Henderson? I have movement." Two men in dark suits. Suspicious activity. Over. He waited for a response, his heart pounding. A crackly voice came through the walkie-talkie. "Stay put, Arthur. Observe and report. Do not engage. Over." It was Agnes, her voice calm and professional. Arthur continued to watch as the two men entered the building. He relayed their actions to Agnes and Mr. Henderson, feeling a surge of pride at his contribution to the mission. After what seemed like an age, the two men emerged from the building, carrying a small briefcase. They got back into the van and drove away. Arthur immediately reported this development. "All right, Arthur." Mr. Henderson's voice came through the walkie-talkie. "Mission accomplished. Head back to your house. We'll take it from here." Over. Arthur, feeling a little deflated that his role was over so quickly, nevertheless felt a sense of accomplishment. He had played a part in a real spy operation. Later that evening, Agnes and Mr. Henderson joined Arthur on his patio for a debriefing. "You did well, Arthur," Agnes said, offering him a genuine smile. "You followed instructions and provided valuable information." Mr. Henderson nodded in agreement. "Yes, Penhaligon. You surprised us. For a moment there, I almost thought you knew what you were doing." Arthur beamed. "So, does this mean I'm officially part of the team now?" Agnes and Mr. Henderson exchanged another look, this time with a hint of amusement. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Arthur," Agnes said gently. "But you certainly showed potential. Perhaps we can incorporate some more structured training into our routine." Mr. Henderson chuckled. "Structured training involving inflatable boxing gloves and strategically placed garden gnomes?" "Precisely," Agnes replied, her eyes twinkling. Arthur couldn't have been happier. He was finally part of their secret world, even if his role was more comedic relief than master spy. His quiet suburban life had been irrevocably changed, filled with the exciting possibility of impromptu training sessions, clandestine missions, and the constant, delightful absurdity of having retired spies as his maid and neighbor. He even started looking at his own collection of garden gnomes with a newfound respect, recognizing their potential as both decorative items and crucial training obstacles. His mornings would never be the same again. The Wall Street Journal would likely remain unread, replaced by the far more thrilling spectacle of suburban espionage unfolding right outside his window. And who knew, maybe one day he'd even master the art of the pool noodle pivot. The possibilities, Arthur realized with a contented sigh, were endless. As the stars began to twinkle in the suburban sky, Arthur sat on his patio, a contented smile on his face. He sipped his Earl Grey tea, the familiar comfort now tinged with the thrill of recent events. He glanced over at Mr. Henderson's neatly trimmed hedges and imagined Agnes's quiet efficiency inside his house, both of them harboring secrets that would make any international thriller writer envious. His life might still involve the occasional worry about bond yields and the perfect avocado toast, but now it also held the promise of unexpected adventure, clumsy spy moves, and the comforting knowledge that his seemingly ordinary neighborhood was anything but. He chuckled to himself, picturing his next attempt at silent infiltration. Perhaps he'd invest in some quieter shoes. Yes, life, Arthur Penhaligon mused, was certainly more interesting now. If you enjoyed the story, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you'll be notified when another story is posted. See you in the next video.